Product Management in SRE by Jayaganesh Kalyanasundaram. He's from Google.
This session is going to be about product management in the whole of both of Ops, DevOps, and also that of SRE. Why am I speaking about this? Mainly because in our team, we had an in-house product manager, and we got a huge number of benefits, and there was like a lot of impact because of them. And it was pretty surprising to us ourselves within Google as to what the impact of product management can be within aspects of SRE. So in this presentation, we'll be going through my experiences in my team and the projects which I was pretty much working with them, and what impact we had, and what are the major sources of the place avenues which can be explored with the help of product manager. So to start off, a brief about myself. I'm working at Google, as I mentioned, for more than 3+ years, and I'm technically leading one of the core initiatives of CI/CD. I'm also a Golang readability approver within Google, so in terms of the language aspects, we use most of this. We use most of Golang, and outside of software, I also am I'm into music. So if you wanted to also speak to me about music, happy to. And if you haven't heard of Dublin/Ireland, it's the place where most of the GOT was shot. So it's a kind of scenic place, and it's pretty analogous to more like Alibag versus that of Mumbai. So it's more calmer. It's more scenic. With that, let's get started. So as I mentioned here, we'll be going through the typical SRE aspects. So it's not going to be something new as such in terms of what we are doing. It's more like how we look at it and what are the aspects where we use product management in it. So we'll be going with these 4 principles and looking at them with the lens of product manager. So this is something which most of you already know with, that the general product lifecycle starts from a concept, which then gets into a business plan. Then we proceed on with the development, and then we need to ship it to the user, so we have those operations, and then we need to go reach the market and make revenue out of it. The business to development plan is the one where we use those agile concepts, where we try to iterate faster and we start building the product. And the part of development to operations is where we have DevOps in general. SRE is supposed to be pretty much having all these 3 as something which they are going to work with. So their stakeholders are going to be the business, the suites developers, and also those operations. The first part of business may be not that intuitive, but it's the best practice, which I'll just get to it in a while, that we would ideally like SREs to be involved as early as possible, mainly because of their expertise in scalability and that of architecture. So let's start with a very basic concept of that of SLOs. So many of you might know him. The whole of SRE is his brainchild. So he's a VP at Google who mentioned something which most of us would just agree with directly, which is that 100% reliability is a wrong target for pretty much everything, right? So then the question comes, what is the right level of reliability? And SLOs are meant to be that if those SLOs are working well, we have happy customers. If they're not met, we have bad customer satisfaction. And right there, we have customers, which brings in the involvement of product, because we don't want to measure customer satisfaction through the lens of just engineers. We want to see if the customers are actually happy, we have some feedback from them, and so on. And other thing which most of you would also agree with here is that historically we used to have monoliths, which made a lot of these things very simple, because we have one big system, and we can pretty much define everything in that system, and we need to measure that system. But over the last decade or so, we have been converging more onto microservices, rightly so, because we have a lot of other benefits of microservices. And one of the issues with microservices in terms of SLOs is how do you measure them? Because it's no more one single black box or like one single box. It's a lot of small services which interact with each other. And at the end, you want to measure the overall customer satisfaction or the things which actually matters to the user. So it's a common anti-pattern that people measure what they can measure. So it's more often than not that we have SLOs per each of these microservices, and which is not the intention to do so, right? So just to kind of recollect, we would like SLOs which measure the user satisfaction. Then the next question comes is, what is the journey you want to measure this from? And this is a common source of like confusion between multiple stakeholders. I'll just give you a quick example. So as I mentioned, I'm in a team which works on CI/CD within that of Google. So we handle things like the Docker image aspects within Google, and how do you want to ship it, and do we have policies like as we just saw in this in this talk before, right? This one. So at the end, there are different stakeholders. We have product, we have UX, we have engineers, we also have tech leadership, and each of them have a different notion of what is the user journey. Let's take a simple example of rolling back a version. Like, this is something which most of you have done at least once or twice whenever your services were not working as intended. We want to roll back a service. So let's say we have a good application interface, we have a UI where we want to do a rollback. The engineers wanted the journey to be, you click the rollback button and that sends an RPC to the backend. That's it. If that RPC is sent, the work of the rollback button is done. Rightly so. There were tech leads who were not agreeing with that. They went a bit further. They were like, you know what, not just the RPC call, but I also want to understand what I get back from the RPC, which is basically that if I just click the button rollback, and it sends an RPC to the backend, which instantiates the workflow to do the rollback. At that point, I would call that I have made this user journey where the whole rollback has started. But the overall owners of the product, including the leadership, were interested in something different. They were interested in how well this rollback is happening in the actual experience, which is the rollback actually succeeding? So you could click the button, and it could send that RPC, but the user could still hit some kind of wrong road. So the rollback experience is still not kind of complete for them. So right now with these three user, these three user persona rather, we have an engineer who wants to look at the first initial RPC, we have a tech lead who wants to look at instantiating the workflow, and we have the product owners who are looking at the end-to-end. So the product manager of our team jumped into this discussion because this was super critical, and the way we mitigated this was we built a system where we can define the user journeys and so-called critical user journeys, CUJs, have them documented so that all of the people are in the same space, so we all know what we are speaking about, and we have the collective understanding of what is that user journey. And once you have that, you just need ways to measure that. Which also brings to another interesting point in terms of the engineering kind of challenge as to how do you measure SLOs which are across multiple microservices. Because right now microservices have led to a phase where we have isolation at multiple levels. We have resource isolation, we have memory isolation, we have those logs based isolation, we also have ACL isolation. So everything is different for those microservices. At that point, how do you make the collective sense of the whole system with these multiple microservices? So for handling this at the engineering level, we used something similar to the unified logging services, where we wanted to keep the context of the request from the beginning till the end. When it kind of goes across multiple microservices, we want to be able to track that. We want to be able to make sure that when those requests goes, we exactly know where it came from, we're able to trace it back. But anyway, coming back to the point of those CUJs, so we came to a point where we were able to define those CUJs, document them, and rightly so, get approval from them. And this was a standard process set up by the team's product manager. And this has helped us leaps and bounds in ensuring that we have the right kind of context across multiple stakeholders, and we all are in the same terms. And the next obvious thing to an SLO is what happens if SLOs don't work as intended, which is why we have SLAs and on those consequences. And again, this is something which we don't want just an engineers to do. By the way, in the whole talk, when I meant, when I mean engineers should not do it, it doesn't mean that if you're already, if you're doing it as some kind of engineer, it's wrong. It's just more to say that you're already using your kind of product management hat. Maybe you don't have a separate title or a separate role in your firm, but you're already into those shoes. So yeah, the next point is about consequences. So this involves a lot of back and forth and negotiation with multiple stakeholders. And this is again something which the overall product owns in general. And we have had multiple such stacks within our team as well. So what happens as a consequence of that as well, which is you have SLOs. Sometimes we are well over the budget, sometimes we are not. So we have some kind of error budget, which is the difference between the ideal reliability and the reliability we have now. So we could be doing well, or we could be somewhat doing bad. If you're doing bad, we need someone to step up and say, you know what, we need to stop a lot of these new feature requests. We need to make sure that the overall reliability is restored. And this, again, involves a lot of stakeholder management with the leadership. And we have been in the same state multiple times. So we have been in these shoes where we had a hit on our overall SLOs, which was being actually promised. And as a result of that, we had to take a back step to ensure that we fix our reliability first. And sometimes it could also be the opposite, which is you're doing very well, which means your service is probably at now pretty much 4 nines, where you promise those users just 3 nines of uptime. This should be mostly fine, except that with time, this sets a wrong example for the user. So if your customers have a different sense of the SLOs and the reliability of a service, you are at loss on a longer run, because they're going to start making new assumptions that, you know what, this service works way better than what I expected it to, and hence in my designs and in my architecture, I can use it as one of those most critical components, whereas they should not be doing it so. So something which we do in our team is intentionally break the services and bring down them if we are doing well over our promises. And this is something which I think many teams would also agree with, which is that when you have a hit on reliability, you have other components as to project works which you have already committed and which you have promised, and you have some impact delivering out of that. Being able to take back these promises means that you are not going to make your stakeholders happy, and sometimes that's going to backfire on you. So handling these communications properly was an other essential aspect where our team's product manager stepped in. And just a fun fact, we started with one specific product manager in a team, and now we have a group of 4 of them, and we have collectively realized the impact they have, and we are starting to grow this impact over the whole org, and the whole of that of SRE in also general. So with that, we go to the second principle, which is making tomorrow better than today. And this is something which all of us do and want to do on a day-to-day basis, be it that of SRE or software engineering or any other discipline you're part of. And one of the obvious things you need is that you don't want to be overloaded with a lot of toil and a lot of work already on your plate, and you want to be able to think and explore what you can do better. And one of the things which we saw in the last section was that we have those product owners / managers who define and refine the SLOs, who enact those error budgeted policies whenever they are required, and who ensure that we have those reliability aspects set up in such a way that it meets the customer needs. And we also know that as an SRE or ops in general, we have a lot of this toil, and many of us also know that we want it to be at max 50% of the workload, just so that we can start iterating more and having more project work, so that over time we can reduce some part of it. We want to pretty much automate ourselves out of the work. So These are components to it. But these project work could be of variety of sense. So this is what I mentioned in the starting, that SRE also should be involved in the aspects of the business and even the phase before the development. In the morning, in the very first lecture, we had a bit of information given on TPUs and that of GPUs. So it's pretty interesting. I'll just use that example here. So in about 2019, Jeff Dean, the VP of the whole of Google Research, announced that we are going to be having these TPUs. And back then, these were new machines which could do a lot of those ML computes. We didn't have any infra for them. We didn't know how they're going to work. We didn't have any knowledge on how we are going to scale them, how we are going to maintain them, and so on. So we started doing the designs. I mean, when I mean we, the Swedes involved in that process started doing that. And they kept the SREs in the loop constantly, even in this initial designing and and those architecturing phase. And it rightly helped because first, their reliability and the designs was up to scale, was up to the quality, which can be easily onboarded by that of those SREs. Because we don't want to end up in a phase where someone builds something and they have handed them over to these SREs, and SREs are just tasked with kind of maintaining them. That's not a nice place to be in. Because we want to be involved in something which we want to eventually take care of. And that worked out really well. At the end, we had a pretty good reliability of those services. We had a very nice onboarding in general, and that experience was super smooth. And obviously, we have a lot of these things as to automating repetitive work. We want to even automate ourselves out of the job, and that's the kind of eventual goal of SRE and that of software in general as well. And with that, we also want to ensure that the product is involved into all these major decisions, because at the end, whatever improvements we make are for the product. So we want to ensure that the product is involved into each of those key decisions we make and the improvements we make, whether they are going to be lasting for longer, what is the customer impact it has, and so on. And as I mentioned, the SRE's work is not to just be some pager monkey to keep up those load on pager and just to suffer with those toil, but it instead is to make the service reliable. And this, as I mentioned, starts at the phase where the whole system is even being designed. Which brings me to the next kind of pillar, which is shared responsibility model. And many of the firms would be already kind of following this because this is by design that we have the product teams, the whole developer teams, which staff the SRE for ensuring that their whole services are maintained and they are all, they have uptime, they are reliable and so on. Which means there is a very good connection, or there should be a very good communication between the developers and the SREs. And dumping all the production services on the SRE team wouldn't work. And this is a very common anti-pattern that the SWE developer teams build a bunch of new services which they hand off to the SRE teams to start maintaining. And we need a good amount of leadership buy-in for all these things because it's the leadership which even sponsors the whole SRE team in general. At the same time, it's the leadership which should be enabling the SREs to make the right call on which services they want to maintain and what is the amount of reliability they want to do and what is the amount of toil they're already experiencing and what is the way forward for that. And the product owns a key responsibility here, especially to define what has been the status so far and where do we want it to go. If I have to give an example from my team, we recently onboarded some services from our SWE partners, which was at a state where we didn't have much context on. At the same time, these were super important for the users. So we had to play we had to play the whole negotiation right in such a way that we are able to maintain the gap between what we know and we can be held responsible for in the system's reliability versus what is being dumped onto us. And it's a pretty important factor in general for SREs to maintain this split and balance because you want to be able to ensure that the services which you hold are getting better with time. Which brings me to the next point that if your services are not doing well and you are constantly not meeting your expected SLOs. And I'll also get to an example here, which is, as I mentioned about the rollback button, we had this experience, so we finally defined the user journey as you click the rollback button, and you want the whole operation to be done and the rollback to be finished, and you want to measure the number of successful attempts in the rollback. Turns out we had a target of 90. We achieved a target of 40, which is like less than half. And that led the team to a kind of panic mode where we were not able to meet those SLOs for multiple months and like repeatedly so, and we didn't even have a good explanation of why that happens. And when we digged a bit further, turned out about 30% of failures happened because the users weren't allowed to work with that production service. So they didn't have those permissions and they didn't have the necessary ACLs to work with those services. And rightly so, they should have the failure because you don't want to mess up with someone else's production services. Another 30% were failed because it so happened that you start the rollback came to such an extent, and then the user kind of interrupted it with some new RPC or just preempted it, or they didn't want to proceed further, which is again an intent of the user. You don't want to call that as a failure. So we went back, we redefined what we want to measure here, and we lowered our overall targets, and we have made it to 40% now, because that is what is the feasible one, and that's what we want to measure, and that's pretty in tune, because that is the exact practical happening in place, and we don't want to be held responsible for something which we don't have some control over. The reason I mentioned this 40% explicitly is because as SREs, we have this mindset of going to pretty much 4 nines / 3 nines, if not at least 99, if not at least 90. We started from like that same target as well. But to choose your target and to choose your SLOs right and to loosen them up, relax them, is pretty critical, because else you're going to have targets which you're not able to reach, not because of your mistake, but because that just can't happen. And fixing a product before the launch is always more easier, and that's why we have a lot of these launch kind of processes in place. We want to ensure that we have the quality in place and so on. And all of these are generally true for those product teams. For SRE teams, these are not generally the case, because SRE projects are generally to improve your own services or to improve your tools which you use to maintain those reliability. But we repeatedly hit the same bottlenecks in multiple quarters with respect to these launches, with respect to bad aspects of reliability. And mainly because we didn't have integration tests for them. We were not measuring how well they're working. So our product manager stepped in and basically said, you know what, we're going to extend this product launch like plan / process to also the SRE-based features and not just keep them for the actual developer-based features. And this has helped us leaps and bounds, because now we have a good product quality, or at least like those kind of feature quality for every new feature we launch. We know exactly what is the impact it has. We know what is the level of reliability of that feature. Is it tested with integration test? Is it having those unit tests in place and so on? And we also measure what is the impact it has with those metrics and stuff separately, which are generally the part and process of a launch plan for any kind of product features. So again, going back to my initial statement of thinking of SRE as a product is, we are at a time where we have evolved SRE by pretty much leaps and bounds. We started at a place where it was just operations, and it became of both dev and operations, where we want to ensure that we build some tools. But now we have come to a state where we can think of them as a separate product by themselves. And automation is something which we keep doing at multiple places, and also rightly so. And if you think about it in general, SRE has 4 major pillars. CI/CD was the reason why SRE even started in the first place. There were these developers who built new features. They wanted to ship them out, and they found it really hard. So then they had a separate operation teams, and that's how this whole DevOps thing started. So CI/CD for sure is the most important aspect of SRE. And the very next section to that is the alerting and that of monitoring. And recently, a lot of the bigger teams and bigger products have faced this, that they go to customers and sometimes the number of customers who use it or the number of usages can increase drastically. To give an example, if you're watching some cricket match, it's likely so that the amount of the traffic you have in the system is quite high, especially for that of Google Ads, mainly because you have a lot more users browsing the system and trying to understand how something is working, and these are avenues for you to do well as part of Google search and ads. So I just gave examples of that, but this is kind of also true with things like Hotstar or Facebook, where pretty much any kind of launch events or any big events you have, you want to be able to size up your capacity drastically. So that brings us to first that of CI/CD, second the aspects of monitoring, alerting, and the third aspects of capacity planning. The fourth is kind of hidden in all of these and generally in the whole of SRE, which is incident management. When everything works well, we are all happy. We have a pretty good kind of communication. We have in fact, excessive communication. We have a lot of documents and so on. But when we have an incident / outage, we get into some panic mode, and it's really hard for people to have a proper sensible conversation of what is happening, what is the root cause, and how do you mitigate that. So having a process in place or having a system in place which can help you navigate this is the fourth important stuff of incident management. So these four things are pretty much common across any vertical SRE teams. So it might be of your best interest that in your firm, you start automating these three things separately. And this is something which we do at also Google, that we have taken these four aspects separately from each of the teams so that the teams don't do the repetitive task. And it also gives them a lot of additional benefits. Like, imagine there are a total of 10 SRE teams and each of them are building their own CI/CD based tools. You have 10 tools to maintain. You have a big cost to that. You have 10 tools to improve. You have 10 tools to have your features on. Versus you have one tool which all of them converge on, which means if there is a big kind of incident / outage, you have some postmortem, everyone gets benefited from that. It's not just one team. And you don't have the cost of maintaining 9 other such tools. So we are at a place where we can think of these concepts as products. And in the initial talk today, we had a brief mention of that we have come to a state where we are at a pretty good situation of how do we want to, in general, do this process. How do we want to do monitoring? How do we want to do alerting? How do we want to do these aspects of CI/CD? We are at a good place where we have practices for doing that. It's probably the best for us to think about them as a product in general, which can help all of the teams at once, instead of each of them investing onto these things separately. And to conclude this specific section, it's mainly that SRE teams have the ability to be able to regulate their workload, which helps them having more time to do the project works and to actually improve the overall service reliability. And the point 3 of able to actually push back on the unreliable practices and systems is something which is kind of quintessential component of SRE. And the product plays a great role in these aspects to be able to navigate these communications. And we have had a bunch of these discussions where we have had a kind of upper management based discussions where where we have been asked to take up a new service, where we have been asked to onboard a new service onto the SRE teams. And we were able to rightly push back with a proper set of practices and also those suggestions as well. And because each of the new systems has a new cost to it, like you need to maintain it, you need to first onboard onto it, you need to fully understand it, and many times you're not even involved in the room when these systems were built. So that brings me to the fourth point, or the fourth pillar, which is the culture of blamelessness. And this is pretty common across SRE in general. We have this aspects of blameless postmortems and not pinpointing a specific user or a team when something fails, but instead using that as an opportunity to grow further. So, as I mentioned before, postmortems are something which we want to be able to make it available to everyone so that every team can learn from that. And this brings me to that to the just earlier point which I mentioned about having convergence onto tools so that you don't have the same postmortem happening at multiple places. Which also brings us to humans' errors are the really source of, like the big source of problems, right? So we want as little interaction with the tools as possible. Not to say we don't want to have enough knobs to tune and tweak when we want to be able to play with the system to make it better. But in general, it's of the best interest that we don't expose all the inner details because that's going to let the user kind of confuse it up and kind of play around with it in non-intended kind of sequences and which ultimately costs to us. And this is a place where UX play a big role. What interface you want for the users? How are they going to use your services? What does it mean that your service is now publicly available and people can start using it? What happens if they can't use something and they want more inside access like to the tools? So these are something which the UX and the product managers and the overall product owners work very closely with which help the engineers on a longer run because it's of the best interest that we don't export all the access and all the underlying usage informations to the user. So to bring back, failure is an opportunity to improve and not an excuse to just brandish pitchforks. So when a failure happens, this is something which many of the teams already do. We want to be able to ensure that the mean time to detect and the mean time to repair on those kind of circumstances are improved after this postmortem because we have clearly hit some mistake and it's of our best interest to detect that as early as possible. And again, stop pointing fingers. We want to have it as blameless as possible because we want the actual source of problems to come up. And to proactively addressing system means that you have a more robust system overall. And what this means is that we want to be able to ensure that SREs are involved into the systems as soon as possible because with the years of experience and the years of encapsulations we have had, we want to be able to advise what is the best interest for the system. And those are the 4 principles which we just briefly went through with the lens of product manager. And generally we also have the next slide as we are hiring within Google, but because of these macroeconomic situations, those have changed. But yeah, nevertheless, we have these SRE books which have a good written format of pretty much a lot of things which I mentioned so far. They also have examples of how these things were done within Google. And they also have this SRE workbook, which is more like how do you implement SRE? Because the first SRE book was what happens within Google, and the second book is how do you implement it if you have a new team and if you are starting out your own SRE org within your firm. So that's pretty much my talk. I'm happy to now take some questions.
Hey, hi Jayaganesh, this is Sumit. So I believe there's a fine silver lining between cost optimization and reliability. And in startup phase, most of the company focus on cost optimization rather than following SRE principles or DevOps. So what do you like? Your opinion, like what should be the right approach here? Like, do we need to follow SRE principle, from the starting of the startup phase, or should we wait for us, to have a market fit in future? So
Yeah.
what's your opinion on that?
Yeah. I think it's of the best interest to decrease the cost with using SRE practices. Like, to put it simple, it's on a longer run, it's definitely more beneficial to use these SRE practices to even decrease your cost. Because if you're going to do some new ad hoc practices, that's going to bite you on the back. But I still get a point that it's probably going to be harder for them to invest onto these SRE practices. For example, having a dedicated product manager is going to be difficult. I get that, but that's where things like the leadership jumps in with themselves owning to the aspects of product manager, which is something which happened for the last decade at least, right, we didn't have a separate dedicated product manager for most of these aspects. For if you want to define SLOs, it was not the product manager for a lot of these teams. It was mostly the initial engineers who did that. So, I mean, as I mentioned, this is a kind of role. It's not something which you need to hire separately. It's something which you need to just wear a hat of. So, you probably can skill yourself up for these type of thinking. But yeah, I think that's a pretty hard thing, and like fortunately or unfortunately, we haven't faced that at Google now. So it's. I mean, I'm not able to pretty much empathize with that. But I would say our history says that using SRE practices from beginning is generally beneficial for also cost reduction on a more longer run.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you. So you mentioned leadership buy-in and SLO as an outside-in view. And you mentioned that if there is a failure, there are two things, either relax the SLO or you could increase the resources. Now, what are the key challenges? Because it's the leadership who brought in the SRE. So what are the key challenges to get the leadership buy-in? Who owns this? And what is the fallout of not having a buy-in on the SRE team? 3 questions.
Sure, thanks. There's a famous saying within SRE that if suppose everything works, leadership says everything works, why do we need an SRE? If again nothing works, the same statement comes that there is again nothing working, why do we need an SRE? So there's a balance between them. But coming to the point of who makes that call first, right? So it's the owner of the product in general, because they have the best interest and they have the vested interest for having the overall reliability of the system. That's needless to say that engineers are equally involved in the, or should be involved in the process. So should the actual leadership be. But because the product managers and the product owners own the product journey in general, within Google that has helped us a lot. When they own this journey and they help and they pitch in for these leadership buy-ins, it becomes a lot more easier for the leadership to understand the actual kind of problem, because most of the north is also about communication, because engineers are more into the internal implementations and details, whereas the leadership is well abstracted from that. So having that person in the middle who understands both of them and who knows why they're being funded as a team, and also helping that message pass back on, saying that, you know what, we initially promised this, but looks like we can't support it, and it's of our best interest to not support it because we would have customer satisfaction still being supported. Like kind of passing that message back on was at least something which we faced pretty hard in our team, because we didn't have a pretty good spokesperson for those aspects. So product manager was the one in our team who did most of the job. Again, back to the first question as to if you don't have a separate product manager in your team, what do you do? Generally, the upper leadership, when I mean leadership, the more of tech leads. So sometimes I myself kind of have that hat on to play the role, but there are pluses and also minuses of that.
So leadership is the product leadership.
The product owners, yeah. The leadership, so the overall leadership is the one which kind of funds you first, because they are funding you, they want impact out of it. But there is a leadership for your own product, which is owning the product in the sense, right? They are responsible for the whole product journey end to end. And it is best represented by them, from my experience at least so far.
And the challenges, why would they not be convinced to take one of those two decisions?
Sorry, what is that?
So the challenge saying that either reduce or relax the SLO or fund an improvement or give more resources. So why would that at all be a challenge? You see the leadership not getting a buy-in for.
So the challenge is, first of all, if you don't have resources, which is the case right now, right? We have a lot of these hiring freezes and like those are layoffs, which basically brings you to a state of resource crunch. So you may not be able to kind of pour more resources onto your system. So that could be some genuine challenge as well. And there could be also those restrictions within your org as to what is the amount of headcount you have. But the other challenge of losing your kind of SLOs, it kind of looks different when you say that you want to meet an SLO of 40%. So if you are brutally honest, if you want to commit to the user saying that 40% of your request would be successful, people are going to have different mindsets to it, and they wouldn't probably know the full depth of it. So that is one of the reasons. So that's why it makes a lot more sense to make them understand why this is a challenge by itself. And we have been successful at times. We have also not been successful at times. So And the way we have got successful over time is like being able to establish that credibility that, you know what, we know the background, we know the implementation, we know the user satisfaction, we have surveys to do that. So we are saying with all confidence that even decreasing this is not going to hamper any user satisfaction, because that's one of the major issues for the actual leadership, because they fear that if we're going to lower the satisfaction or these SLOs, it's going to hit on the customer satisfaction, which is going to decrease the amount of retention or the usage in patterns in general. So if we have good justifications for that in terms of data saying that, you know what, we are planning to decrease this SLO, but the same state has been for the last at least 4-5 months. So we haven't lost any users for the last 4-5 months, and we are pretty stable and we are doing pretty well. I think those things is what helped us like in our journey.
And just my last question, so when you say this right product team, leadership, is it not the sales or the customer success team that comes with the pressure on the product? Because if the buy-in comes from there, you will actually have somebody putting dollar on the table.
Luckily, most cases are not. In SREs, we don't have sales coming to us directly. The sales, sales is obviously the final source of pressure for everyone. So sales has indirect influence on us, but more so than not, we have been abstracted from that and we have been insulated from that kind of pressure. The pressure from us is generally from the immediate leadership. What I mean is, when you have an organization, it's going to be funded by certain folks because they feel that there is a need for doing so and they have a proper motivation for doing so. And with time, they want to be able to see the return of investment on that. And sometimes it could be the case that your SRE teams take more time to set up than not, and that delays the amount of impact you can have and potentially makes the leadership unhappy. And which is one of the kind of things which I mentioned in the starting, right? When you have promised features which you don't deliver, it pisses them off. So things like that needs some amount of good communication, which is why we have this whole communication channel set up by product managers, because they have established the rapport, they have established the sense from both the engineers and the upper management in terms of the amount of credibility they have. Maybe we are lucky, but this is what we have been following over time, and that has worked for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Jayaganesh, for the amazing talk, and